Russia and China would kind of be like the U.S. in the sense that they are so powerful in enough by themselves that any like like a security umbrella with them is that would be the same like NATO. We are not NATO and Europe is not a regional security pact. We are a vassalized union under the United States, which have sure we have our mini empires under there, right? But we are like take Norway for example again our military, and this is explicit, right? We don't call it vassalage. But when our military explicitly isn't meant to withstand an invasion for more than 48 hours before the alliance can come to relieve us, and the alliance would, of course, be that's over half of it would be the United States. This is de facto us relinquishing our military sovereignty, but we are able to have some domestic sovereignty, right? And this becomes then the very definition of a vassal.
Well, then that kind of reflects back. How do the people in Scandinavia like react to this? I mean, I understand the governments of Scandinavia, they're hyper vassalized. They're going to listen to whatever the DoD and CIA tells them to do. But I mean, there's got to be some sort of dialogue in the streets between people. Like is propaganda as effective as it is here in like the western parts of Europe and the United States, or is it a little bit different?
For where I live, it's in the northern area, so it's a little bit more rural. We also have a more aging population, so it's not totally representative for Norway, but the propaganda seems to be more unquestionably effective among the older population because it seems to be reviving that earlier propaganda regarding commies and all that kind of stuff. The Cold War and Soviet Union. And here it is very difficult to like even the more reasonable of our senior citizens in their 60s, 70s, and so forth can be you might be talking to like a teenage fanboy or something, right? Like it's not possible to have a conversation. When you come to and I'm like 38, I'm almost in my 40s, so that would be here. The general consensus is that we are Norwegians first and foremost, and then NATO second. But we are on the side of NATO, and so for me, I kind of try to nuance the discussion like that. It is, it's not either or. Like we are alone without NATO. Of course, that's a false option. I don't think any reasonable person trying to get us out of NATO means that we should be then by ourselves. And but there isn't really, the media and our government is certainly never going to be presenting that option anyways, as going out of NATO with someone else. So it's for most people my age, the propaganda is that NATO is pushing us, or I shouldn't say most people, but a lot more than of the elderly generation. They seem to get that, yeah, NATO is definitely at fault here, but Russia is ultimately the one who is the most at fault. Like a team mentality will still play in. And then as for the younger generation, if they even care at all, they will just like, yeah, well, I mean, Russia is the bad boy or something. That's it. They don't even care to discuss it anymore. By and large, a short answer to your question, yes, the propaganda is quite effective even around here. We have a lot of, like Norway having been a vassal of the U.S. for such a long time. And I think this can even be recognized in any other vassal state or any client state. Singapore, for example, would probably be, another side of the world, but just like Norway, it has such a strong influence from the cultural hegemony of the United States that the propaganda, which is tailored primarily to the American population, is kind of effective against the rest of the Western population because it's sort of implicit where we are at this point with or like it's normalized that we have to be a team with the United States, even though the United States is, by any objective measurements right now, it's not an ally of ours, it's an enemy. I mean, they're doing hostile acts with pushing us into a position where we are clearly being deindustrialized, and then they're taking subsidy measures. I mean, this is supposed to be the most capitalistic nation in the world. Barring that the biggest socialistic institution in the world is the U.S. military, it's also not really operating under the free market ideology that it only does so when it fits it. When it is in the strongest position, it will do so. And here it sees that, okay, well, our fossil fuel industry, for example, needs to be empowered. Oh, there's so many factors. It's just like the veneer is coming very quickly off, though. More and more.
That's what I wanted to ask. How common is it to see people like realizing like, hey, yeah, I mean, we get all this good stuff from the United States, but it's, I mean, eventually it has to hit people in Europe, and you guys have to like sit back and notice, like, hey, we don't even have our own military to protect ourselves. We don't have our own industrialized system to protect ourselves. Hey guys, if your entire, like, I mean, you talked about this, how the proof that most of Europe is vassalized is because you guys don't have your own domestic militaries, or at least sizable domestic militaries. Does that
It is explicitly, formally, it is meant to rely on what is essentially the United States.
Right. But is there any sort of, I don't know, dialogue among people, like, hey, what happens if the United States kind of steps back from us? We have no fallback measure.
Yeah, it seems to be whenever I mention that, like, for example, why should we be provoking a clearly stronger neighbor? And it is our neighbor after all. The United States is on the other side of the pond, right? So, like, why would we want the rivalry between these two powers to be pushing us into a conflict? Because no matter how you twist and turn it, we wouldn't be in any much different situation than Ukraine here. We would be the battlefield. We would take the brunt of the violence that can be, you know. Conveyed by these two powers, one way or the other, be it proxy or otherwise. And so when I try to kind of point it out to the, like, yeah, okay, fine, we are somewhat protected by the United States, but when the United States is also kind of setting up radar station and military installations and having joint drills right up the border in a way that is like clearly provocative, and they're kind of showing like we are making exercises that are meant to attack you, right? So like when this if this is our alliance and it is actually not, it's sure it might have the military might to protect us, but if it's pushing us closer to conflict, it isn't a matter of security, it's a matter of dominance, and that is not better for us. Like, who's going to take the brunt of it? It's going to be the average person, right? The people who, most people like to flee, they flee right away, and then the rest of us will have to face the outcome. And
Which is already
unfortunately,
happening, right?
well, I mean, not in my area, but it is. I mean, we are finding the domestic ones, but this has more to do with um, the corruptionist ideology going around in the world, where you can blame pretty much everything on anything else, except, for example, excess money printing that has been hidden, or that there is a monopolization around the world that enables price gouging, and so forth, so forth. So the and so this Putin and all the others are used as an excuse. They like to kind of keep that propaganda going, but no, it's very difficult. Like I think if I remember your question correctly, Alan. No, most Norwegians, at least, because we are the ones in Scandinavia who are, and Denmark who are a part of NATO. So maybe a Dane would like to join in and give their opinion on that. But as for Norwegians, no, they seem to very much have a hard time getting out of the mindset that we cannot be on the same side of the United States, or the notion that the United States could actually take actions to harm us seems to be completely out of this world for them. Even though our pension fund, one of the biggest um, uh, holdings of money and assets, like this is basically where we have reinvested our oil revenues and so forth. It's one of the biggest in the world. Um, and 40% of that one is of the state-owned bonds that tend to be issued through that fund. Now, I'm not going to get too technical, but the point is that the United States have, through the dollar, because the dollar is very heavily over that fund. So 40% of that fund is controlled by the dollar. So if the Americans wanted
Okay,
to
well, you can take this a
really,
step further. If the dollar is what most of that fund is, then you could also make the statement that that fund is completely imaginary, because
it is,
yeah.
yes, absolutely, it is. And this is a thing that has been criticized quite often by many, but it kind of falls on deaf ears because where the thing is here is like I was saying, with if the dollar stops being the reserve currency and it crashes or something like that, this is essentially because Norway has set up this fund in a way for it's more as a buffer against crisis. So one of the rare cases where it was a kind of punctured a bit was during the COVID, but then there was also a lot of money printing involved, whatever, and then. And it's meant to be for the future generation when the oil revenue stops, right? But it's hedged on the US dollar to a large extent. So it's like saying that, well, our future well-being is hedged on the US. And if they choose to, they can actually torpedo us Okay, it's not like Russia. Like we could not resist like that at all, right? So, and this same goes for quite a lot of countries, but I think Norway might be somewhat more closely aligned, or maybe I should say tied. It's difficult to say. They seem to be a little bit more closely linked to the U.S. Than the rest of the EU is. So if
Mhm.
you want to kind of you perceive NATO, then you would perhaps want to distinguish the UK and Norway as a different kind of NATO ally to the US compared to the rest of the EU. Because the rest of the EU, they will be operating with a lot of their own, like they have a kind of a different framework of interest.